Tony Wright is a consciousness theorist who believes mankind is currently in the thrall of its own dangerously unbalanced brain, whose development peaked long ago in a golden age spent in fruit symbiosis in the tropics. Drawing on mainstream scientific data, he claims the evidence is overwhelming and calls for urgent research. He points to neurochemical analogues which provide brief glimpses of the kind of consciousness we've lost, and suggests a three-pronged approach to improve neural functioning. I started the interview by asking him to outline his theory about how the structure of our brains has become compromised and dysfunctional.
I would say we've assumed that our neural system's functioning. How does it work? And I've taken a step back and looked at the evolutionary context, the molecular ecology of our distant ancestral environment, through to our behavior and the neurological and psychological data, and specifically on the left-right brain, the sort of split brain research, put all that in one place and kind of looked for common denominators, bearing in mind that we're actually using the equipment we have between our ears to figure out what's going on. So yes, in essence, I'm saying rather than our neural system being functional, I think it's been reverting to a more primitive state, less functional state, over quite a long time, perhaps as much as 200,000 years, slowly at first, more quickly in recent times. And a key element is based on this classic split brain data, which has many interpretations and so on, but some really good data as well. And I'm basically saying that one side of our brain has regressed or reversed to its more primitive type much more quickly than the other. And unfortunately, we've ended up primarily running on the side that's the most regressed. It's reverted more quickly, and that's the side we're running on, the left side of our brain, which tends to be the rational, conceptual side, and it's given itself a clean bill of health in many ways. When we look at this data, a lot of the summaries coming out of neurology and psychology tend to lean towards the left hemisphere having specialized adaptations, which kind of fits with classic evolutionary theory, and it's entirely understandable. But of course, there's a danger here when we're self-assessing, particularly when the left brain's looking at the data and going, "Oh yes, this is what's going on." Particularly when the data itself, the fairly objective data, is highlighting some very bizarre traits with our neural system, particularly with the hemisphere that seems to be mostly influential in our perception and our behavior. Things like propensity for delusion and confabulation, continual lying that we're not even consciously aware of, a world built on concepts which we all kind of are familiar with, but in fact concepts aren't reality, and so on and so on. So yeah, a lot of clues, I think. So yes, in essence, I'm saying our neural system isn't remotely functional actually, and I think one side's in very poor shape. It's like a pretty dumbed down and rather dysfunctional version of the right hemisphere, but that's what we're running on, and that's what we're using to self-assess. And so we have these huge contradictions where a lot of people think we're evolving and things are getting better, hand in hand with a sort of a level of self-harm that in any other situation would be seen as a massive symptom of mental ill health. You know, we're destroying our home and we're waging war on ourselves. That's what we're doing in effect. And a lot of our best technology is designed to kill huge numbers of humans. So, you know, few minor clues there. There's a massive amount of clues. In fact, the challenge I sort of lay down on a lot of occasions is there's no way I can get away with such a radical idea if there's not, in fact, a mountain of objective evidence. It's just asking the question and being willing to ask the question free from our conditioned ideas and our beliefs. Is there a serious problem? And if there's not, it'll become readily apparent, and there shouldn't be a threat. It should be a really sensible question to ask. You know, we should be very happy to check in and see if our neural systems develop properly and functioning properly. It should be a healthy and sane thing to do. On the other hand, if it's not, if there's a serious problem, so serious that it's actually difficult to spot it, but there will, of course, be huge amounts of evidence. And as I say, you know, our collective behavior as a species is clearly insane. Anybody who thinks otherwise, I'm quite happy to stand by the fact I think they've got very serious problems. Fortunately, a lot of people are very concerned. I'd say the majority of people think there's something wrong, don't necessarily know where to look, which again is a classic enigma if there's something wrong.
So one of the pieces of evidence that there's something wrong with the hardware is the behaviour of the species itself on a planetary scale.
Well, I'd say that would be inevitable. I'm talking about a species-wide condition. I'm saying it's serious, and it leads to severe perceptual and behavioural problems because, and again, there's a lot of detail in this, as you know, but in kind of a simplistic way, one of the key players is our hormone regime, particularly our own steroids such as estrogens and particularly testosterone. They play a role in this condition, and therefore, in a simple way, it affects males more than females. It's not exclusively male, far from it. It affects both genders, but it affects males more than females, or at least males exhibit more extreme symptoms. So again, I'd expect species-wide insanity, and I'd expect males to exhibit the more extreme versions of it, and that's exactly what we've got. We have the emergence of patriarchal and hierarchical systems, typically devoid of any kind of empathy or compassion or any grasp of reality whatsoever, and yet creating civilization in their image and often coercing the rest of humanity to sort of follow suit.
Yeah. So there's evidence lying in the pathological behaviour of the species. What kind of evidence is there in the actual operation or the structure of the brain itself?
Well, I think, again, if you're to visit or revisit, depending on how familiar you are with the classic left-right split brain research, now as I mentioned earlier, it has many interpretations. Some people are quite dismissive of the simplistic notions, but I'd say the data is actually very good. If you're willing to look at the data and accept that you have a left hemisphere, which the data is obviously discussing, and be willing to step back and not jump to preconceived ideas. Just look at the data as objectively as you can, and it starts telling a very different story. So I think there's a lot of clues in there, bearing in mind, the data pretty much comes up with these two conclusions. One, the left hemisphere, particularly the neocortex, the most recent part of our brain, the neocortex in the left hemisphere is acting in an executive way. It's having a massive impact or a massive influence on our perception and our behavior, plus many other functions as well. So it's effectively our normal sense of self. Who we think we are is primarily to do with our left hemisphere. So bearing in mind that it's looking at the data, that's, of course, potentially a very dangerous situation. So look at it by all means, but be wary of the conclusions of the authors of the papers, the authors of the books, and your own preconceptions. Once you step back from that, what starts to emerge is something very interesting. It looks to me, and increasingly to a lot of other people, that the left hemisphere has a lot of pathology. It has a lot of things that are considered specialized traits that are in fact pathological traits. If you just step back and dump the baggage, so you've got
before we get onto that. Sorry to interrupt. Is this sort of dominance of one particular hemisphere? Is that normal in animals or mammals?
It seems to be unusual in humans. Humans seem to display a particular degree of dominance, particularly perceptually. Certainly, our perception seems dominated by a left hemisphere. Other functions, there's some kind of split, some kind of cooperation, but again, a lot to talk about in that. But certainly perceptually, behaviorally, we seem to be dominated to an extreme degree by our left hemisphere. There certainly seems to be some parallels in other species, although it's more to do with preference or much more collaboration and coordination. And people presume that's what's going on with humans. They talk about the left and right have evolved together and they work together. But again, if you look at the data, that's actually a very rational or left brain conclusion. So yes, I think there's good data in the neurological literature and the psychological literature, but you have to step back and look at it with fresh eyes. And then I find it most intriguing. It's not proof in itself, but I'd say there's an incredibly well put together story in all the ancient traditions that are effectively describing the onset and progression of this neurological condition. The origins of sort of shamanic tradition, the spiritual tradition, and even the major kind of conceptual religions that have emerged from that, they all kind of have common themes that talk about degenerating into a deluded state, which again is there in the modern neurological literature. Fascinating, these two things correlate very well. These traditions talk about becoming more primitive and losing abilities and perceptions that our ancestors had. Well, again, in this left-right split, if you forget about specialized adaptation for a minute, you can frame it another way. It looks like the left hemisphere has a lot less of the functions the right hemisphere still potentially has, bearing in mind it's usually locked away and it's hard to get at, but potentially there's a lot more function there. So again, these parallels, interesting, these traditions exist, and they're very ancient traditions, and they crop up in all cultures, and they're talking about some form of degeneration, something to do with a perception changing, a behavior changing, a lot of talk of delusion, which again is in the modern literature, and even, the emergence of two distinct selves, and one self usurping the other, seems to fit very well with this idea of classic cerebral dominance, which has been around for, a good 40 years or more, but many interpretations, and nobody's really stepped back and saying, well, if cerebral dominance is real, we have to be really careful here because we're trying to assess this data with the dominant piece of equipment. Now, if it's specialized and highly adapted, fine. If it's actually a degenerate version of the other hemisphere, then we're in trouble. And that's the question I really want to get out there. At least ask this question and look at it dispassionately, look at it without preconception. If everything's fine, great, we can move on. If it's not, we really, really need to look at this, because this is our primary piece of equipment. It's what we use for all the decision-making, all the experiments. It's flying aircraft. It's making decisions about going to war. If there's a serious problem here, the only sane choice is to at least look at it with urgency. And if there is a problem there, it's pull the emergency stop. We should be stopping what we're doing in terms of decision-making, policies, whatever, until we've addressed this issue.
Yeah. So when you mention other cultures having a kind of a myth of this, are you talking about the fall and this kind of thing, the fall from paradise?
In essence, yes. And again, it's often not by everybody, but certainly by some people, dismissed as kind of ramblings of primitive minds, or it's a kind of classic human psychological condition where we want to think that the past was better somehow to deal with the challenges we face. And some elements of that may be correct in some situations, but beyond that, there's this universal story that's, again, it's often very specific. I
only know about the Judeo-Christian version of the story. What other stories have there been about this?
Well, there's parallels in the Buddhist tradition, in the Hindu tradition, and many other lesser-known traditions to Western culture, at least, same in South America. Pretty much all the ancestral stories talk about a very different state of being, something happening in this step-by-step degeneration into a much lesser state, and that includes a lot of the indigenous tribes also. They have parallel stories. Same with the Aboriginal sort of Dreamtime stories. So there's patterns there in all these ancient stories, and they all talk about a degeneration, parallels with the classic fall from grace. And I think the Judeo-Christian story is a classic example. In fact, in some ways, I like that example because it talks about our origins being naked, so it must have been warm, forest dwelling, and fruit is actually explicitly talked about, and trees are given quite great importance. Now, whether these are metaphors or not, who can say? But it's interesting that story exists, and the modern data from anthropology and primatology seems to tell an exactly similar story. We were forest dwelling. We were naked. Our physiology suits the non-seasonal tropics. We have a frugivorous anatomy. Wonderful parallels there. It's not proof, of course, but bizarre these things exist. And I think when you start factoring in the biochemistry, the sort of molecular environment, and what the pharmacologists have come up with and the endocrinologists, if you start putting together your typical primate, your typical mammalian sort of endocrine system, neural system, and hook it in with the flowering plants, and particularly fruit, which is something we've all grown up to think of as something different we can eat. But actually fruit's the equivalent of the mammalian uterus. It's a wholly different scenario where it's really the plant's equivalent of, well, it's a developmental environment. It's where the whole new generation is developed, and forming a relationship with what are effectively the sex organs of plants is incredibly unique. You know, we have these enigmas around human evolution. At least many people think there's still mysteries to be solved, where classic Darwinian theory has been quite good at explaining, you know, a lot of species and how they've emerged in various traits. When it comes to humans, still this mystery about some of our traits, and particularly the size and function of our brain and the fact that it expanded so amazingly quickly. Well, what unique elements are there in our evolutionary history? Well, we have this relationship with fruit. And that's an incredibly rare thing. Fruit only emerged in reasonably recent times in terms of evolutionary theory anyway. And to form a perpetual relationship with it, the only place you can do that is in the non-seasonal tropics, not even the seasonal tropics. These elements seem to exist, or certainly were in the right place at the right time. And when you're talking about fruit, you're talking about a hormonally very rich environment, loaded with chemicals that affect and alter our own endocrine system, particularly during the developmental windows. So you're going to get a different outcome. It's basically reading our own DNA very differently. These elements all seem to exist. And if you speculate and imagine what would happen if you put all this stuff back and look at some of the key players, again, probably too much detail for this interview, it's all online and so on. It starts looking like you'd end up with a situation where we'd have extending juvenile periods. Our brain architecture would be different. It would have to be different. And the fruits are often loaded with chemicals that are incredibly protective of a neural system, very high in antioxidants. They're loaded with chemicals that are mildly neuroactive. They're loaded with chemicals that change the way the DNA is read. A whole complex of things that are incredibly unique. Staring at us in the face, it's already in the data. You know, it's already accepted that primate origins are to do with the forests, forming relationships with fruit, seed dissemination, and so on. Nothing new here. I'm just providing a context and saying, look, all these bits join together and they tell us something about the state we're in now.
So you think we were developmentally, in terms of our brain, at a peak 200,000 years ago?
More or less. I mean, peaks always, I use the term peak and peak of evolution just to highlight the sort of way we get dogmatically attached to terminology. Most evolutionary biologists would say there's no such thing as a peak. It's just a process. But nevertheless, in terms of cognitive function and perception and so on, I'd say somewhere in that region, approximately 200, maybe 250,000 years ago, that seems to be the sort of smoking gun when this incredibly rapid and accelerating expansion of our neural system, you know, the most complex thing we know, incredibly expensive to build and run, was accelerating at this incredibly rapid rate, which is fascinating in itself. And again, lots of speculations as to why it suddenly stalled. It stopped expanding. And to me, that's equally as interesting. What were the mechanisms driving it? Why did it stop? And in fact, a slight shrinkage in the last 200,000 years, maybe 10, 15% or even more perhaps. So I think the stall and expansion is the smoking gun, and that looks like 200, 250,000 years ago. But of course, new data may emerge. It may be slightly earlier than that. But that's the sort of window, yes.
And why did this stall happen and this degeneration? What was it that brought this about?
Well, again, there are several competing theories, but my proposal focuses particularly on this symbiotic relationship with fruit and how, in fact, it was the complex fruit biochemistry that was driving a lot of our changes. It was directly influencing our endocrine system and directly influencing the way our DNA was being read, therefore changing structure, changing developmental windows and so on. So this direct relationship, and a lot of the variation was coming from the competition between the plants. Obviously, the plants were almost in competition with each other, trying to make the hosts more interested in their particular free gift, this swollen sex organ, you know, loading it with more and more chemistry that made it more appealing. And if that happened to be the same chemistry that was changing our endocrine system, changing the way our DNA was read, you see this potential for a runaway feedback loop, very, very rapid. And that's what I think happened. And again, no real contradiction with the orthodox data. The only sort of difference is people have looked for clues whenever there's evidence of human ancestors or humans outside of the forest. They're kind of highlighted as, oh, this is what we're looking for. This is when humans moved out of the forest, got smart, grew a big brain. Well, it could be the opposite. These could be refugees or early exclusions from the forest, where coming out of the forest with an incredibly functional neural system, you're going to survive at least for a while. Doesn't mean this magic formula in the forest that was driving it all is going to sustain that neural system. And what I'd expect to see is waves of migrants, possibly primarily, almost certainly because of climate change, where you get the forest expanding and shrinking. Well, if your neural system, if your perceptual equipment's dependent on this tight relationship and the forest disappears, you're going to be in trouble. You might survive, you might speciate, but in time your neural system's going to degenerate because the components required for that expansion and function, that were an integral part of the functioning, have gone. So it's like being left with a clapped out old sports car, no manual. You don't know how to run it anymore. You don't know what to put in it. The potential's enormous, but it's just not going to work. And yeah, I think back to your original point, climate change is probably the most likely candidate, I think, simply because tropical forests can be very stable for evolutionary timescales, but they are ultimately the Achilles heel in this theory. If you get a very severe drying, and it looks like there were severe dryings, including a severe drying in the right window, roughly 250,000 years ago, if the forest goes, you're in trouble. And humans, our lineage may have been one of the last of the lineages that stayed in these very small niches, these non-seasonal tropical forests. The longest. We may have been the last, effectively, to break this connection.
Okay. I'm thinking that potentially this could, or you could look at it as a natural process that as at the planetary scale, the planet has created these through the forest, these incredibly advanced primates. There's then a shift in the ecosystem. And these advanced apes have to then move and be propelled around the planet. Could you look at it in that way, that this is almost a kind of almost intended that humans were supposed to be created and then sort of sent out by climatological change? Why look at it as a kind of a catastrophe?
Well, that's a fair point, and I guess it's a case of make your own decisions, make your own choices. I look at it really as a catastrophe on all sorts of levels, but particularly on a very subjective level. A lot of my experiences in life and a lot of what I see around me, bearing in mind, I live within Western culture where it's supposed to be relatively advanced and we have what we need and stuff. It's actually incredibly stressful and traumatizing for the most part. And looking at the damage we're doing, if all of that's coming out of a state of mind, I would say, no doubt about it, to me, it looks like a catastrophe, particularly if we have the potential. You talk about clever apes moving out of the forest. Well, a lot of the terminology we use, it's back to the core of the theory, is very conceptual and separate. If we're in fact just an aspect of this evolutionary process, and in fact, if anything, it's more like the forests really provided the biochemical complexity, and they got smart by building this thing, but obviously it was a physical separation. If we're part of this whole thing, rather than separate entities, and we have the capacity to repair ourselves or bootstrap ourselves back into a state of something closer to sanity, then I think that's a choice we have. We can certainly choose to go down this path, but it doesn't look very promising to me. Quite the opposite. It looks like we're right on the edge of reaching a point of catastrophic failure. Really, certainly within relatively short periods of times. But if we have the capacity to understand, like a diagnosis, once you have a clear diagnosis, if you can understand the pathology and there's things that can be done to rapidly change it. Yeah, sure, that's a choice. That's a choice for everybody to make. Personally, I'd rather choose to try and repair this thing and then even begin addressing some of these questions, because it looks like from all the data and all these traditions, currently as we have a lot of latent function locked away. Whether it's full function, that's a whole other question. But if it's possible to improve our state of mind, our perception, our cognitive function quite quickly, to me it seems a sensible thing to do would be to do that, make that a priority, and then even begin asking questions, because we probably don't even know what questions to ask at the minute if things are as bad as they look. So yes, it's very much make your own decision. Is it something that we have no role in? We're just sort of passengers on a slow motion train crash, or in fact, actually, are we driving the train? We just didn't realize it, and we can put the brake on and go into reverse and actually do some repairs. And going back to the whole archaic tradition, this Arcadian mythology that's come down to, is not only is there a diagnosis, if you care to look for it, there were also what we currently call practices and various traditions. If you strip away the dogma and belief, there were a lot of what I would call treatments for this condition, treatments for a neurological stroke psychological condition. And a lot of them are fairly to moderately effective, particularly if used in combination. A lot of knowledge has come down to is where we can make changes that will bring benefits, some of them virtually overnight, and more powerful changes within weeks, months, or certainly within years, by putting back this complex molecular ecology. We call it diet. It's in fact not diet at all. It's advanced molecular engineering. I mean, currently what we build and fuel our neural system on is an absolute joke. It has nothing to do with biological evolution. We laughingly call it junk, and we wonder why a neural system doesn't work. And then in addition to that, we have all these practices, as I say, I call them treatments for this condition. Anything from meditation and yoga to some of the more powerful shamanic approaches. They generally fall into, three camps. There's the rebuild. Natural diet's mentioned a lot in these traditions. So that's a molecular rebuild. Then on top of that, you have treatments that will generally inhibit the left hemisphere. Remember, the left hemisphere, through no fault of its own, it's just part of a pathology, is causing the problem. It's a more primitive, dysfunctional version of the right, but it's perceptually in charge. So there's techniques to inhibit that. And there are also techniques to stimulate the right hemisphere, which has a much higher specification, needs a lot of unique fuels to start to begin to work properly anyway. Combinations of those approaches together with a kind of reverse engineering rebuild, and you can start getting pretty amazing glimpses pretty quickly, sufficient that it'll change your perception forever and inform your choices, even if you're still stuck with this rational mind that's quite frightened, quite clumsy, etc., etc. You can make informed choices based on experiences that tell you something else lives in here as well, and it's a whole lot better. And those kind of things could be rolled out very, very quickly. In fact, we have legislation and we have social taboos coming from a frightened rational mind, mostly from these patriarchal, hierarchical, male-dominated systems that tell us these things work, because there are legislative approaches to stop us using them. It's that simple. It's a guide to what actually works.
Such as which things are you talking about? Psychedelics.
That would be the more powerful end of things. Sure. I mean, we have living traditions still on the planet where people have used what I would call neurochemical analogues. I don't think they necessarily were necessary when a neural system was functioning, but I'm saying it's in pretty poor shape. So it's almost like emergency an emergency approach where you're using these neurochemical analogues to stimulate the right hemisphere sufficiently that it can partially reverse dominance, it can partially become self-aware. And of course, by definition, it's a very different self-awareness, very different to what we're used to. Question is what we're used to actually real? Do we see the world as it's supposed to be? And the physics tells us we don't. The ecology tells us we don't, and yet we trust it as if it's real. But if you start getting glimpses through some of these other approaches, including the sort of traditional use of plant medicine, psychedelics, or, it can be as simplistic as music and dance, complex music and dance. So these things were often combined, traditional trance dance, where you'd end up dancing, perhaps that involved also staying awake, another approach, and then perhaps taking a well-tried and tested cocktail of neurochemical analogues, and that combination of things would take you out of your normal self and into a state that usually is described in profound words, and the words are usually pathetic. People talk about divine and a sense of love and so on. Well, I'd rather live in a world where that's haphazardly being re-engineered than the world we live in now, where it's all about concepts that have nothing to do with reality and the idea that actually things are getting better. It's crazy to me.
So why did the left hemisphere degenerate and the right not degenerate to the same extent?
Well, it's a good question, and it comes up a lot, and hopefully I can give some clearer ideas. Really, I think it's because there was always genetic asymmetry between the hemispheres, and there's more papers come out on that in recent times. Initially, it was speculation. I couldn't find much evidence 10, 15 years ago, but there is evidence now that the hemispheres, certainly in your typical mammal and probably even earlier layers of the brain, were always genetically distinct, one slightly different to the other, probably for very good reasons. So it gets into this slightly confusing area where there probably always was some specialized adaptation going on. So a slightly different encoding for each side of the brain. Now, very simplistically, to run through this, if you add this cocktail of the chemistry from the sex organs of plants, which is a whole other kingdom, so it's doing a whole bunch of different stuff, in theory, it has the capacity to start eyeing out this genetic difference. It's kind of a lot of genetic encoding works on windows of activation. So you have a certain level of steroids, the genes will read. If you have a greater level, they'll switch off, or a greater level again, they'll switch on, and so on. Classic example being age of puberty, where things like estrogens and testosterone reach a critical mass. They're always there, but they reach a critical mass and they switch on a whole bunch of genes that bring us into sexual maturity. Well, when it comes to the neural system, similar thing. If you flood the system with a class of chemicals, you can effectively iron out this genetic asymmetry and in principle allow the proliferation of a rapidly expanding brain, that although the coding's distinct in each side, the end result structurally and therefore functionally becomes very similar, almost identical. Okay, so that's the idea, that our neocortex, through this rapid expansion phase, as it was expanding, this genetic asymmetry was still there but being ironed out, and we ended up with a neocortex, each side virtually identical and unique in many ways, but the encoding's still there. Okay? So if this symbiotic relationship breaks down, if the neocortex is exposed to this much more archaic regime, the regime that our own genome, our own DNA produces, we have a fairly typical mammalian genome, and it just produces fairly typical endocrine system and so on. Once you expose it to that, then this genetic asymmetry is being re-exposed, and this very delicate new structure that couldn't possibly have evolved in our archaic hormone regime is exposed again. It's gonna have an asymmetric response. One side's gonna respond more quickly than the other. It just happens to be the left side. It could have been the right side, but it happens to be the left. And it's responding more quickly. It's reverting to its primitive origins more quickly than the right side. So it's in answer to your question, it's because there's inherent genetic asymmetry. It was supposed to be there. It did a good job a long time ago. According to the theory I proposed, this was all ironed out courtesy of the fruit biochemistry, and in turn producing a completely unique neocortex. Break that relationship and the genetic asymmetry is exposed again, and one side responds differently to the other. And rather than specialized adaptation, which is a lot of current thinking, I'm saying, no, both sides are reverting to type. They're reverting to primitive type, one side a lot more quickly. And paradoxically, we've ended up primarily running on the side that's much more primitive.
What could you use as evidence to appeal to mainstream neurochemists or neurologists to say, look, this is degenerate, and we have to sort of put a safety net up and stop this and halt it and go back in the other direction?
I'd say really probably the most powerful way is in the sort of spirit of debating and so on. It's laying the gauntlet down and saying, look, this should be easy to dismiss out of hand. If there's not a serious problem here, I'm not talking about a mild condition that a few people have. I'm talking species wide, and it's serious. Okay, So the challenge would be, okay, take this on board, be willing to ask these kind of questions and look at your own data, look at your colleagues' data in the different departments, the different disciplines. Be willing at least to consider this archaic mythology. It's considered pretty irrational and non-scientific, but it exists. So it's something to deal with. Look at the mechanisms and look at what would happen in terms of engineering, reverse engineering, and address the question and face it and ask, is it possible that we have a serious neurological problem? But you have to be willing to take that on board. You have to be willing to look at these pieces of the jigsaw and be willing to put them in place and then challenge it, then say, no, it just does not work. Our neural system's fully functional. At which point, okay, then I've got to look again, or I've got to look at how people come up with these conclusions. But that's never been done. As far as I'm concerned, in modern science, at least that's never been done. So I'd say that's the gauntlet to lay down. Address this question with an open mind, not jumping straight to conclusions or not looking for the thinnest parts and going, oh, there's a weak part here, the whole thing must be wrong. Look at the context. Look at the overall context and address it from that perspective. And remember, and interestingly, in the modern data, the left hemisphere is incredibly bad at context. It cannot juggle more than a couple of bits of information and put them into a coherent picture. That's something it's very deficient in. Hence, our modern science is called reductionist science. It's seen as a very good way of looking in detail. Actually, it's a symptom of pathology. It's because our neural system can no longer hold the whole picture all at once. Some people can. Some people have access, and they can juggle phenomenal amounts of information and kind of rearrange it in their minds. Typically, most people can't, and yet that's what's doing the science. So we have all this specialist data and very few people talking to each other. And it's a problem that's acknowledged, it's known about, but it's not seen as a pathology. It's not seen as a symptom of a dysfunctional neural system. So I'd say, even addressing these questions, even the way we look at the data, you have to factor all that in to the possibility that we have a neurological condition. Again, it shouldn't be a threat. This shouldn't be something that we should be worried about. If our neural system is fully functional, what have we got to lose? It's just a sensible thing to do, surely, to check in once in a while that our primary equipment is as functional as it can be. That should be a sane thing to do. If there's any evidence whatsoever that there's even a moderate problem with our neural system, surely a sane response would be to seriously and thoroughly investigate it from as many perspectives as possible. Now, all I need to do is create, reasonable doubt. Well, I think there's not reasonable doubt. There's phenomenal doubt. There's overwhelming evidence there's a serious problem. And in fact, I'd go back to the earlier parts of what I said. I think the condition is so serious, it's like classic mental ill health. When you have a mild condition, typically you're aware you have a problem. If you have a very serious problem like full-blown dementia or Alzheimer's, generally you're blithely unaware you've got a problem. And I think that's how bad it's got. That's how bad a situation we find ourselves in, through no fault of our own, by the way. I don't think nobody's to blame for this. And interestingly, that's echoed in these ancient traditions. They talk about this progressive slide and sliding into delusion to the point where we don't even know we're deluded anymore. We all understand the concept. I understand the concept of delusion. It doesn't help me one jot at all knowing whether I'm deluded or not. And that may be the situation we're in. However, there will be evidence. There must be evidence, or it's wrong. And I'd stand by that. There must be evidence in the modern reductionist science, for all its failings, has generated mountains of data, and there will be a smoking gun there. Absolutely will be.
But you have nothing to suggest at this point as to what that might be.
Well, yes. I've tried to put together what I can see are the disproportionately important elements. So again, I've focused on the split brain research. I've particularly suggested that we look at the traits of the left and right hemisphere, which has been, there's been a lot of information on that. I'm just wary of the conclusions, because there's this self-assessment loop which is very dangerous. We have to be aware that if the neurological data is correct, then our executive left hemisphere is making the interpretations, making the conclusions. That's very dangerous. Is it possible there are other conclusions? So I'd say there's a lot of evidence there. There's a lot of evidence in the mechanisms, the known mechanisms on how the endocrine system is massively influential in the development of our brain, and how the masculinization of the neocortex, how that must have been radically different if in our evolutionary past we were flooded with chemicals that biochemistry, chemicals, hormones that radically change the way these steroids work and change the way they're enzymatically transformed into other hormones and so on. It must have been radically different. The current normal range of masculinization must have been an awful lot less. And masculinization, which is currently seen as normal, is linked. I mean, Simon Baron-Cohen is a researcher in Cambridge. He's made this link, as have others, that what is considered normal masculinization of the left hemisphere, and testosterone's involved in this, it seems to equate to degrees of being on the autistic spectrum of disorder. You know, loss of compassion, loss of empathy, inability to connect, and so on. But that's seen as normal. Well, if you put
you're talking about the development of the male brain here. Is that what you mean by masculinization of neocortex?
Well, it applies to the male and female brain, but I'm particularly talking about the male brain. That's where most research has been done, and as I've already mentioned, because testosterone's a key player in this, males get hit hardest with this condition that I've outlined.
But the process, the masculinization of the neocortex, you're talking about how the left hemisphere becomes the dominant executive.
Yeah, and develops its so-called specialized traits during our early development up to puberty and beyond, and testosterone plays a big role in that, although ironically it's partly because it's converted to estradiol, which is classically seen as a female hormone. Never mind, the point is our own hormones play a big role in that, and currently, for the most part, they're unchecked. And that's seen as normal. We're seen as an autonomous being, and our own genome must somehow be able to build this powerful neocortex, and it must all work. Well, that's fine, and that works with almost every model we've shoved into the kind of Darwinian machine. However, if our origins were symbiotic, and you know this is hardly news, this is hardly a new idea. If our origins were symbiotic, and particularly a unique form of symbiosis where we were forging an increasingly complex relationships with the sex organs of plants, and remember they're loaded with hormonally active chemicals and so on, then there's a direct effect there. We become a symbiotic organism, particularly anything that emerges from that symbiotic union. Anything that emerges from that symbiotic union was wholly dependent on that symbiotic environment, that molecular environment. So the neocortex, its expansion and its operation would have been entirely dependent on this complex of biochemistry. And we know that the tropical forests are, you know, the repository of the most complex biochemistry we know by miles, by light years. No accident that some of the most complex neural systems emerged from the tropical forest. No accident at all.
Right. So in the last 200,000 years, there's been this alleged degeneration. Is this what... Has this then created a split personality in us between the two hemispheres? Is that, or would we have had a kind of a split personality before that?
Yes, I think that would be fair to assume. I think we'd have gone through different stages. There would have been this increasingly unified and wholly other, pun intended, sense of self due to the expansion and the new architecture, the new neural architecture that was being effectively designed by the fruit biochemistry. It's like we were genetically re-engineered by the fruit hormones. It's the hormones that read the DNA or affect their own hormones and so on. So we had this increasingly unified executive layer, this neocortex, that was providing, and by the way, I should make it clear, I don't ever claim that we are our brains. Somehow our neural system facilitate our sense of self. So I just want to make that clear. I'm not saying we are our brains, but it obviously plays a pretty massive part in our perception. And the neocortex, so it's rapidly emerging, and it's providing, or it's facilitating this increasingly unified sense of self, very different sense of self. Now, when this relationship breaks down because of this twin track degeneration, yes, you're going to get the emergence of two distinct selves. And these ancient traditions seem to allude to that, and there's echoes in modern society with bipolar, schizophrenia, and so on, and also very much in the split brain research. You'd have this emergence of two selves, no doubt a period of cooperation, then slowly as one side becomes more degenerate, degeneration, loss of traits, loss of function equates to fear, and it's inherently more primitive. You get more fear, more need for control, combined with the loss of this incredibly complex biochemistry that both sides needed to run at one time. But now one side, being more primitive, it can accommodate and run on lesser materials. The right hemisphere, because it's degenerating more slowly, it has much higher specifications. It will not run properly anymore. So put those two things together, and it's actually relatively easy for the left hemisphere to take control. It's more primitive. It has lesser requirements. It can run on all kinds of material, which we know, but it's not going to sustain it. It's not going to maintain high function. It's almost accelerating its own dysfunction. So yes, you get an emergence of two selves, but eventually, as the left hemisphere begins to more completely dominate, something that I think happened generally more and more in the last 5 to 10,000 years, you get this emergence of a singular self again, emerging from these two selves. And we refer to ourselves as singular, even though the split brain research suggests otherwise, suggests we have two distinct personalities in there, but one we very rarely access.
But we can get a taste of that that previous level of consciousness when we do things that supposedly are more right-brained.
Yes, that's back to the potential fast track for treatment. Again, once we recognize a condition, I think that's the biggest challenge here, is recognizing the nature and specifics of the condition. And I think we've been given a lot of clues by our ancestors, a lot of clues in the modern literature. And then personal experience. I mean, people have experiences spontaneously that again, they often find it difficult to put into words. And this is common throughout history and regardless of culture, regardless of beliefs. And the language people use, although their culture and beliefs can color how they explain it, the feelings they experience are universally very similar, if not the same. And it's profound, it's divine, it's amazing, etc., etc. And accessing those states, there's a whole toolkit, there's a whole treatment approach that's become very much fragmented. We've lost a lot of the understanding as to how these things work. But if you start putting these things together, as more and more people are starting to do, certainly getting glimpses of these states isn't at all difficult. It's not mysterious. It's not 50 years sitting in a cave waiting for something to happen. It's actually quite formulaic, and I think it needs to be formulaic. I think we're in such terrible trouble that it's pointless speaking to people in poetic philosophy and talking about esoteric traditions and so on. I think we need something in a pretty simple language. And I think using modern reductionist language, which is pretty dumbed down after all, is the language of the left brain. So you talk about neurological condition, you talk about treatments, you talk about approaches that will dampen down the effects of the most degenerate hemisphere and stimulate the latent function in the normally suppressed hemisphere. And hand in hand, you start rebuilding and providing some of the complex biochemistry that went missing. So you almost viewing it like an engineering project, which is very much left brain. I totally accept that. But that's the language we need, I think. And yes, there are a whole range of treatments, some of them very mild, which is probably the sensible place to start. Some of them much more powerful and effective. And they're all much better used in combination. I mean, for example, you mentioned psychedelics earlier. There's a whole tradition of use. It's sprung up in Western culture. It's been endemic in indigenous cultures forever. But often a lot of attachment. Well, this is the only way to do this. If you take certain plant medicines and doors open and it's all wonderful. But that's missing the complex biochemistry that was an inherent and necessary part of our function, putting this biochemistry of the forest back. So I'm not talking about 2 or 3 key neurochemical analogues that can really stimulate the right hemisphere. I'm talking about this immense complex biochemistry that's often missing from these traditions, and vice versa. You get a lot of people interested in what we call diet, or again, I like to term it advanced molecular engineering. People very attached to, well, if you eat a natural diet, well, that's the answer. And yes, it can make some significant differences, but it will not overcome left hemisphere dominance, not on its own. It'll make some shifts in some people, and so on and so on. So it's putting these things back, and when you start putting them back in combination, it really isn't so difficult to at least get glimpses, and with practice, you begin to navigate and begin to recognize that there's a phenomenally different self available. So yeah, all these things are possible. We have an awful lot of information. I think the real challenge is coming up with a clear diagnosis. The solutions aren't that difficult. The practical problems aren't that difficult. It's the fact that we're still deluded. We still don't even know there's anything seriously wrong, and we don't know what the mechanisms are.
Yeah. Do you make any conjecture or theory about this what this might mean for us spiritually, or when we do have these experiences of this other part of our brain, Are we misidentifying it as divine? It's just more that we are in a state that is more pleasurable, or there's a sense of finding this other identity that perhaps is communicating with us through dreams or our unconscious. Is this the higher self that the spiritual traditions talk about, or guardian angels? How does all that fit together for you? Do you come up with any conjecture about all that stuff?
It's a good question, probably a highly emotive question for a lot of people, but I think they're ultimately one and the same thing. And I'm being very clear, I'm quite intentionally using modern reductionist language, talking about the brain and neuroactive chemicals and so on. But I'm fully aware these are very arbitrary terminology. We have no idea what any of this stuff is. We have the biology, we have the chemistry, we have the physics, and eventually we run out of concepts. We end up with kind of energy, and it seems to transmute itself into different forms, and that's about as good as it gets. So I'm well aware of the paradox. So I use those terms, again, as a gateway because it's accessible to the rational mind. But ultimately, it ends up in a place where all the terms are clearly arbitrary and somewhat meaningless once you can engage that state of mind. And yes, using the idea of the neocortex and the neural system, well, really, what does that mean? It's particular and specific patterns of energy, if you like. I don't really mind. But if they've come out of focus, if they've twisted in a way that doesn't work anymore, and one of the analogies they use is like a musical instrument, and if the instrument is what we currently call the brain, but you can call it anything you like, and the music is our sense of self, well, we know from historical evidence, current evidence, that the tiniest changes can make a massive difference, including just changing the varnish and so on. Well, if in terms of our neural system, if the strings have been broken or badly damaged, if it's been dropped, if it's been left out in the rain or something like that, which this massive shift from the tropical forest, that's the equivalent. We've lost over 95% or more of the most complex chemical cocktail we know. That should be shocking, bearing in mind it's the most complex piece of equipment we know. It's like stripping out 95% of the technology from a 747 and then saying, it's the same, it looks the same, who's going to get on it? Nobody go anywhere near it. Well, our neural system's way, way more complex than that. And the orthodox evidence suggests it was, at least its origins were in the most complex molecular environment we know, and that's gone. So we should be worried immediately. We should be going, holy shit, there's something not right here. Maybe we can't feel it anymore. Maybe that's part of the pathology. So yes, I think, as I say, all of these things are possible, but we need to recognize what the problem is first. And the last place most of us want to look is in the mirror. And most of us, if we're honest, and I ask this a lot at talks and so on, again, classic mental ill health. Most of us have a low level of fear we're trying to control. Most of us have this endless chatter in our heads that most of us wouldn't feel very comfortable with sharing, even with people we trust. We share a bit of it. We don't share it all. What the hell is that? Is it supposed to be there? Or is it maybe that there's something wrong with us that we don't want to face? And that's, I'm willing to put my hands up and say that goes on. When I ask people, there's a sense of relief. It's not 2 or 3 people in the audience. It's 95% of people going, yeah, hey man, that's what's going on in my head all the time. And this low level paranoia and this feeling of not wanting to be exposed and classic symptoms of mental ill health. And the quickest way we're going to fix this is not be in denial about it and not run away from it, but is actually to own it and say, okay, there's a problem here. And that's incredibly liberating because it opens the door to doing something about it.
How have you experimented these ideas on yourself? I know you did. You set the record for sleep deprivation. So what sort of tastes have you had of the fruits of this research? And there's another pun as well.
Yeah, indeed. Well, it's in many ways it's embryonic, and I sort of view this as a journey of self-exploration combined with this kind of somewhat obsessive drive, which partly came out of the states I encountered to somehow formulate this in a way my own rational mind could understand, in the hope then that it might be more universally understandable. Of course, bearing in mind, that it may or may not have any relevance, but that aside. So yes, I, in the early days, going back sort of 15, 20 years, as I got more and more interested in this, it occurred to me that there were various things I could experiment with, and one of the first things I did was in the simple sense, change my diet. But again, I like to try and change the way we use the word diet, because it's far, far too simplistic, and with all its baggage, it's really about the design. And when I say design, I'm talking about transcription, reading the DNA. So it's about the design, construction specifications, and fuel or neurochemical, biochemical specifications of the most complex thing we know. Million times more complex than the space shuttle or Concorde or anything else you want to think. So forget diet, think about incredibly advanced molecular engineering. So yeah, I changed my diet, back to that, and that began to have some impact after 2 or 3 years. Not profound, but enough to get me curious as to, maybe there were other changes I could start making. So yeah, I got interested in some of the shamanic approaches, and combining what was by then a moderate term, 3 to 4 years of eating this other way, eating this natural diet. So obviously it was beginning to have some impact, because I guess it takes a while to sort of do a rebuild. It doesn't happen overnight. I began to combine that with, I was particularly interested in human sleep. I'd been researching it. I thought there were interesting anomalies that cropped up a lot more with humans than anything else. And there were these ancient traditions that talked about staying awake to access a much better state of consciousness, which of course doesn't make any sense in the modern world. So I began experimenting with sleep deprivation, also combined with what I like to think was a judicious use of neurochemical analogues and the shamanic tradition, putting all these things in the same place, which I thought was probably quite unusual, at least in current times. So yeah, those combinations, absolutely fascinating, and certainly took me to states of, or experiences that shook the very foundations of what I thought was real, but in a positive way, and I guess changed my life direction in the sense that I became quite obsessed to figure this out. It's like, well, what on earth's going on here? Can this be replicated? Can it be made more sustainable? So yeah, the combinations of the things I've been talking about, really changing diet and applying carefully and hopefully with enough safety in mind, the judicious use of some of the shamanic approaches in combination, and yeah, massive changes, difficult to describe, but all fall within the general remit of classic sort of non-ordinary experiences. But what came with that, as I've alluded to, was yes, a potential to explore that more, and it's something I still intend to do. But I kept coming up against this sort of, you could call it insight or intuition, we'll see if it bears any fruit in time, was the really important thing was to figure out a mechanistic map, to come up with a rational map that could make sense of what's already in the ancient traditions, but perhaps is in a language we no longer understand, because remember, the idea is we've been degenerating. We don't understand context very well anymore. Poetry seems like something weird to a lot of people. We don't sing to each other. We have this thing called speech that the left brain considers to be more advanced, but actually in terms of information, it's a lot weaker than singing, and so on and so on. So I wanted to come up with something that was pretty solid for my own skeptical, somewhat reductionist thinking, rational mind, that would be quite compelling in terms of a diagnosis. There's a serious problem here, and hopefully therefore move towards practical solutions. So yeah, I've certainly dabbled with a lot of those things, mostly in the mid to late 90s, occasionally since, but I became more fixated with putting together this map as the next step, and it's taken longer than I expected. I kind of thought maybe, it would take 4 or 5 years, and it's taken best part of 15 to get it this far, but it's starting to, it's making sense to more and more people from all sorts of backgrounds, and it's starting to reach a wider audience, which is really what I set out to do. So I'm hoping the next step after this is to get back to more coherent experimentation in such a way that comes up with sustainable solutions, because that's pretty obviously what we should be doing. If there's a problem with our neural system, who's going to want to maintain that? Who wants a dysfunctional neural system? And there's opportunities to fix it, and anybody who puts their hands up and says they want the status quo, well, clearly there's something weird there going on.
Yeah. What is your background and expertise that led you to get into this area, if you have any?
Well, to be honest, it's mostly self-taught through reading and experimentation, but I did have a bit of a background in plant sciences. I ended up at Edinburgh Botanic Gardens, sort of studying plants, but also part of the course was plant sciences, and I did a dissertation on genetic engineering, sort of genetic manipulation of plants, and or that also took me into basic Darwinian theory and so on, which, applies universally. It's not just to plants. So yeah, basic plant sciences and basic plant biochemistry was the sort of the limited academic background I had, and then from then on it was just applying that and expanding into other areas.
And what are you going to be talking about? Is it the Manchester speaking engagement? What date is it? End of this month, is it?
Yes, I'm speaking in Manchester on the 28th of September. That's a Saturday. It's from 11 till 3, and that's at the Manchester Conference Centre, Sackville Street, which I'm not too familiar with the geography of Manchester, but I guess anybody who knows Manchester, the Manchester Conference Centre, Sackville Street. And yeah, it's basically a presentation I've been working on for a couple of years, although I can adapt it to different scenarios. I mean, the title's obviously intended to draw attention. It's fruit, oral sex, and human evolution. But it's, hands up, it's all botanically and anthropologically correct. If you're eating fruit, it's oral sex. Basically, that's the.
It's a bit of a con. The title's a bit of a con.
It's a bit of a con. Well, partly, but it does, I do look at the whole tantric tradition and how our own access to sexual pleasures tied in with right hemisphere and so on. So
that's what I was going to ask you, actually, you do mention how this degeneration has also affected our experience of sex.
Mm. Well, yeah, I think this degeneration's affected our experience of everything. I think we have either, at best, a limited and constrained version, what I call the left hemisphere version, and in many cases it's totally lost its ability to experience some things. So either we don't experience them at all, or we experience them through a filter, the left brain filter. But occasionally, and using various techniques, or sometimes spontaneously, you can get a much more sort of realistic glimpse of how things are supposed to feel, including what are reference points for our everyday state of being, depression versus pleasure. We have a current scale and we sort of think, well, normal's okay, but how the hell do we know what's normal when it's quite clear, from spontaneous experience, from all the writings that have come down to us from various techniques, that we can experience phenomenal pleasure and feel amazing about it. So we have that capacity, and yet it's considered very rare, and it's often something shunned. We're frightened of our own pleasure, and that ties in very much with sex, of course. And it's long been known there's various sort of degrees of sexual experience. There's a kind of normal sexual experience, which is still pleasurable to some degree and can be addictive and so on, but often quite short-lived. And there are all these traditions and techniques that suggest you can start accessing a much, much more profound level of pleasure that isn't just sexual. It becomes more encompassing than that and much more divine and connected. We have the machinery somewhere. We have the equipment to experience that. Why isn't that normal? And that, I think, applies to a lot of our, rare functions, whether it's high cognitive function, eidetic memory, phenomenal memory. All these things are certainly not left hemisphere because we'd experience them. And all the evidence where it exists suggests right hemisphere. Why on earth is that? Why do we have this, repository of amazing abilities that we can't access very easily? What on earth is that all about? Why do we need any techniques or treatments at all? Why doesn't it just work? What on earth is going on here?
Yeah. Well, culturally, we've sort of rationalized it as these things should be hard won. These things are transcendence. These things are not for everybody.
Yeah. Well, I'd refer anybody to the split brain data research and look at confabulation. And we invent stories to maintain the status quo. We lie to ourselves all the time, and we don't even know we're doing it. And that's in the literature. That's not my research. In fact, all I've done is shuffle the bits around. I haven't come up with anything new here. I've just shuffled the modern data around and said, look, it correlates with these ancient stories, and it's telling us something about ourselves, and it's telling us that actually the last thing we should be trusting is our rational assessment. Self-assessment, if there's any suspicion of mental ill health, self-assessment's incredibly dangerous. However, we have got relatively objective data, and it can tell us to a significant degree what's going on, and it's testable. It's testable. It's not going to be difficult to test this. If you improve your diet, if you engage in these techniques to inhibit the left hemisphere to some degree and these techniques to engage the right hemisphere to some degree, there'll be no significant effect. if it's wrong. If it's right, there'll be a massive effect. Initially, it might be quite bewildering. It might even be frightening. That's something that needs to be factored in, because if we've lost a massive amount of function, of course the way we see the world is going to be very different to how it really is. And a lot of people report this initially, if they have these experiences, like overwhelming, and it's bizarre and even frightening initially. But with gentle and repeated approaches, it's like, oh my God, it makes more sense than normal ever does. In fact, it feels like coming home. That comes up a lot. Now we have this all around us. We have all this kicking off around us, and yet here we are electing people who possibly are in, less neurologically functional state than average, more frightened. They need to be in control. It's not their fault.
Sociopathic.
And we live in cultures dictated by their ideology. What on earth are we doing?
Absolutely. Well, I guess this should be the last question then. How are your ideas being received by the orthodoxy or academics and so on?
Well, I'd say it's early days thus far. I've, pretty much done this independently without the necessary resources. But obviously, part of my agenda has been to parcel this up and get it out to people to have critical assessment and so on. And to be honest, I've been quite shocked at how good the reaction's been thus far. As I say, it's got a long way to go. But from what I consider, some of the sharper minds around and people who have an academic background, been exceptionally good. This, where I've had people, I've sent material to people or books to people and, hope that they might say, oh, well, this might be worth looking at. I've had almost eulogies written back like, wow, this is seriously important. It needs to be looked at and so on. And this is from a range of different backgrounds. I thought, well, I could approach 100 neurologists or 100 anthropologists, but I thought, well, if I just pick on a selection, they've all had similar training. They've all had similar ideas. They should immediately point out the huge flaws in my thinking, but that's not happening. I mean, of course, there are people who rail against this generally without trying to even understand it. I expect that. In fact, I'd even go as far as saying there's already a philosophical paradox emerging that if our neural system's functional, okay, let's presume it's functional, then somebody coming along saying it's seriously dysfunctional, as I said earlier, that shouldn't be a threat. We should look at it, but there shouldn't be any support. It's like I fell down the stairs, I really damaged my brain, and I'm trying to say, look, everybody's neural system's functional. Well, people are going to look at that and go, okay, well, this guy's got a problem, but everything's fine. However, if there's species-wide dysfunction, and it comes in degrees of, which is part of the proposal, some people have this condition worse than others, as a spectrum, if you like, what I would expect is a split. And the split might not be what people would think. It's not just some hippie friends who've taken too many drugs that were going, oh yeah, man, this is cool. Some people are for sure. But right across the board, from ex-police chiefs to academics to creative artists and thinkers, right across the board, people are going, oh my God, this makes sense. Now that should not exist. I'm not such a good salesman at all. It really should not exist. And that does go hand in hand with quite hostile dismissal, which I would also expect if the theory is correct. And that's going on already. If people visit the website Left in the Dark, there's a bunch of testimonies there from right across society spectrum. It's a small sample so far because, the publishing's coming later and so on. But so far, yes, exceptionally good. And it's certainly, I think, and from my point of view, I think there's reasonable doubt here, which is my minimum objective. Reasonable doubt. If there's reasonable doubt that our neural systems function, what's a sane response? And I'd ask you that question or anybody else. What is a sane response if there's a small amount of doubt that our neural systems is functional? What should we be doing?